Well, friends, welcome back to the Space for Faith podcast. It is good to have you with us. My name is Mike Goldsworthy, and what a gift that you would spend some time with us as we are in the midst of this series. We're actually coming towards the end of it, called The Divine Conspiracy Project. And what we're doing is we're taking this book that had been really meaningful to a whole bunch of us like 20-ish years ago, and we're just re-engaging it. And some of you are reading along with us. Some of you are kind of like re-skimming the book as we go along. And some of you are just kind of like listening along, but you're re-engaging in this book that for a bunch of us had been this really important sort of like doorway, threshold, gateway that opened us up to some new and different directions. And as we come towards the last couple of chapters of the book, we are today in chapter 9, which Willard has called a curriculum for Christ-likeness. And I have my friend Justin Morgan joining us all the way from Raleigh, North Carolina. Justin, what a gift to have you like hanging out with us today. Thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike. I have enjoyed listening in along the way, and this is a book that I have worn out, and so am excited to dig into with you guys.
Yeah, now, I mean, I did realize that I kind of screwed you over a little bit by, as I was reading this chapter, realized I gave you the longest chapter to have to read.
Oh, you sure did. I was telling you right before we jumped on, I actually did the math last night because I was kind of bitter about it. Not only did I get one of the final chapters, which many of us who've read this book know, let's just be honest, we do pretty good through the first couple chapters, but this is 300 and some odd pages. So that final chapter I had not read as often. And so I wanted to make sure I paid attention and clocked in at 64 pages, which might be as long as maybe 3 of your guests combined. But we're good. I'm not bitter.
You get the prize for the favorite guest, the most
It's
committed
good.
guest,
Yep.
which I appreciate. And for folks who don't know, Justin pastors a church out in Raleigh called Church on Morgan, which is not named after him, but the street that the church is located on. And I'm sorry that you always have to explain that to people. I was at
Terrible.
an event that you were helping to host at your church a few weeks ago. And I listened to you tell that story to probably 6 different people of like, the church isn't named after me. You've got like your
Yeah.
shtick down.
It
On that.
is. It's pretty hard. It's hard. I don't even include my last name in emails anymore, never in an introduction, but it's still fine with me. And I have to explain this was not named after me. It was not my idea. I've been trying to change the name for 10 years. Eventually, either I'll move on or I'll win and we'll get a new name. But at our heart of our community, I think it's a strong commitment to say that we're a part of the neighborhood and we're here, and that we were planted by a church that was named after the street it was founded on and still there some 200 years later. And so that always felt like a really inspiring idea, but challenging. The other thing is that we're on a corner, Church on Morgan and Church on Blunt, and our crowd can be a bit rowdy. And so we just knew right away that we could not be Church on Blunt, but Morgan it was.
I've heard you use that line 27 times, and it's still funny
Oh,
to
yeah.
every time.
It's still true. I know.
I love it. I love it. Well, a part of why, friends, I wanted to have Justin on here is Justin is so super thoughtful. Like, I love the way you wrestle through stuff. And even like maybe about once a month, I get a text from you in one of our group chats, like where you're wrestling through a text that you're going to preach on. And the way that you think about the text, the way that you think about the Christian life, the way that like you process faith is always so like encouraging to me. I'll often like, we'll throw some stuff around, then I'll listen to the sermon that you did. Like after we throw some stuff around, I'm like, oh gosh, I never would have taken it there. And it's always so beautiful and rich.
Yeah.
And I knew that you'd have a lot to contribute here. So it was that, but it was also, and we'll get into this in a little bit, I know that some of how Church on Morgan got started was with some of the vision that Willard even lays out in this chapter, where he's starting to build a case for like, here's what it looks like to start to reorient the way that he starts this book by like, we've got a problem of discipleship in the church. And then he starts to lay out here, like he's painting a vision for a kingdom kind of life. And then he lays out here is how we now implement that, and starts to maybe get maybe as practical as Willard can get here. And I know that had been a part of the vision of how you had launched your church. And so I would love to, before we maybe get into that fully, I'd love to hear a little bit about like how did you first come across Willard? How did you first come across Divine Conspiracy? What did that origin story look like for you?
Mm. Well, thanks, Mike, for the really kind words too about, and I know so much of our church, our community, those Sunday sermons have been enriched by your contribution over text. I'm definitely a guy who feels like it takes a village. So, um, yeah, Willard's book, I have a pretty bad long-term memory, but my sense of it would have been that I got into ministry. I started out as a youth pastor in 2002 through 2006. And at the time, probably the most influential voice in my life, preaching voice, would have been Rob Bell out of Mars Hill. And I was downloading his sermons and burning them on CDs and handing them out to our staff. And I remember him beginning to uh, start playing with some of these ideas. And the deeper I got in, I realized he was pulling from this source, from this book. And I think on occasion heard him say that it was a really meaningful book to him. I think they may have even done a series through it at some point out there. And so quickly got my hands on it, began to read. And the truth is, I got to that second chapter on the gospel of sin management and just was so blown away and just stuck there for so long. In fact, I still have my original copy, and it's all kind of yellowed at this point. You know, that second chapter, it seems like I was laughing today looking at it, but like almost every sentence seems to be underlined in the way that he framed something that I had felt but didn't have the courage to say, or wouldn't have known how to say, was such a gift. And I think really profoundly shaped my own spiritual life, and eventually even the church that I'd have the gift to lead in the way that we would do so. So my hunch is it came through Rob, but then pretty quickly began to hear so many other people that I love and admire and trust reference it as well. Never got to meet him, never got to even be in the same room as him, but have been really moved by his work. In fact, one of the books we handed out to our entire board and many of our key leaders when we were launching was a collection of essays he wrote called The Great Omission.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of this critique on the Great Commission, that we make converts, but we don't make disciples, or we make deciders, I think was his language, but not disciples. Um, and how shallow that felt, and how much we were experiencing the thinness of that, not only in our own lives, but in our witness. And so that became kind of a real challenge to us of, okay, well, what are you going to do about it? And how might the church look different if this is true?
Mm. Yeah. Well, and some of what I want to do in our conversation here, you and I were chatting beforehand, and as we were chatting, realized like the way that maybe I'd been having some of the other conversations, we're gonna miss some of the richness of our conversations. So I'm not gonna like kind of go through different parts of the book that stood out in the same sort of way, but want to have from the chapter that stood out, but want to have a larger conversation that this chapter spurs on for us, and almost like a I was thinking of it as like you and I read this chapter and we're sitting down, we're having drinks and we're chatting about it and what it kind of led us into. And so in some ways, I think it's going to end up being a really rich conversation for some of you who are listening along. Like you might be disappointed because we won't hit on whatever X, Y, or Z thing in the chapter that was important or meaningful to you. But I think we're going to be able to have a larger conversation that I think actually can be super interesting. So with that, I know I mentioned earlier, like that's some of how you started your church. You said that you gave out one Willard's collection of essays as a part of like early days of the church. Tell us a little bit about like this vision for like how what Willard was doing intersected with like the project that you were creating in this new church.
Yeah. So I knew early on, I didn't know much about starting a church, starting anything really. But I'd come from enough large churches to know, I guess we probably need a mission statement or a vision of some sort, like who are we and what will we be about and kind of what's our win. And at the time, I was being kind of mentored by someone who was surely shaped by Willard's work, part of the 3DM movement, if folks on here were kind of aware of that. But it was kind of addressing a similar thing of like, how do we disciple people well? How do we give them the tools, the practical tools for them to be able to live into the fullness of who God created them to experience the transformation that seems to be promised in the gospel. And so one of the big ideas, kind of naming this challenge, was that, hey, any of us who've grown up in the church for a while, especially those of us in the kind of evangelical right or whatever, who made a big deal about Jesus and about making a decision for Christ and knowing that your eternal destiny is secure and that sort of thing, that we've really dropped the ball when it comes to this life and spiritual formation and what that looks like. And one of the most challenging bits of that I heard from one of those leaders at 3DM was this question. I was in a cohort with a bunch of church planners, and they said, so you want to plant a church? And everybody's like, sure, yeah, that's what we're going to do. And the first question he asked is, well, is your life worth imitating? And we were all like, golly, I mean, who's gonna own that? Who's gonna step up to the plate and say, yeah, my life's worth imitating? And went on to kind of share with us this text that is actually in this chapter this week, from Dallas Willard, from 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And the premise being, if you're promising transformation, that a life with Christ has changed your life, then you should be able to stand in front of that community as a product of that transformation and say, imitate me as I imitate Christ. You want to know what it looks like to follow Jesus? Watch the way I parent, watch the way I manage my finances, watch the way that I do my work, watch the way that I neighbor and serve my city. And as we began to get around each other, this small group that was getting started to launch our church, we kind of felt like there was this major overlap, both between our own dissatisfaction with the lack of formation we've been given in the church, many of us who'd grown up in the church our whole life, but didn't feel like we'd seen many breakthroughs in our own character. And the critique of our neighbors of the church, which is that we're a community full of hypocrites, that we're a bunch of people who have big ideas and opinions about what we believe, but we very rarely live them out. And one little anecdote I'll share just to kind of put a point on it. This was an anecdote that we came back to again and again, but there's this guy, Pete Rollins, who writes these parables. And one of the parables that he tells is he says there's a landlord, there's a gentleman who comes to the pastor's house on a Saturday night, late at night, 2 a.m, pounding on the door. Pastor's like, what the heck is going on? Goes down, kind of in his robe, pajamas, whatever, opens the door, sees it's one of his parishioners, and says, what's going on? What's the emergency? And this guy's all worked up, like, Pastor, you got to help. We got to do something about this. The pastor's like, just slow down. Just tell me the scoop. What is it? What's going on? And this parishioner of his says, there's this single mom. She's about to get evicted from her house. She can't make rent. She's got kids. She's got nowhere to go. We've got to step in. We've got to help. Is there anything you can do? And the pastor sort of kind of getting a sense for the situation goes, well, we got church tomorrow morning. Let's go ahead. We'll make an announcement. We'll take a little offering. We'll see if we can raise some money and keep this woman in her home. And the guy's like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. That would be such a relief. Like, I so appreciate it. I'll see you in the morning. And as he goes, this parishioner to walk away, the pastor looks at him and says, oh, one last question. How do you know this person? How do you know this woman? And he says, oh, I'm her landlord. Right. And it just was this story that like grabbed us. I'm like, is this not exactly what our faith has become? That we are people who are so passionate and loud and regularly blogging and on the news and writing books, talking about all of these things that need to change in the world, but feeling so comfortable from the fact that we live completely opposite of that, as if we have no agency, or this message in some way has not hit our own body, that it's come to this place like Willard, we think it's enough just to think the right things, to have the right pieces arranged the right way. And so our church got started around this idea where we just said, but what if we committed ourselves together to living a certain kind of life over the next 5, 10, 15 years, that one day with integrity, we could actually say to our neighbors, like Paul said to his companions, imitate me as I imitate Christ. What if we created the kind of church that actually brought about the transformation in our life that we longed for? would that not be the greatest apologetic we actually have available to us, the best evangelism tool? That if our neighbors saw our lives transformed, surely that would be better than any argument that we'd come across. And so this was like the compelling horizon vision we had for how we started our church. It was the thing we were committed to. And so pretty quickly we got to reading lots of books by Willard and Richard Foster and so many others that people would know, kind of looking at what are all the resources, what are all the spiritual disciplines, reading through the scripture, finding out kind of what were the things that people did there to experience that transformation and growth in their life. Began as a church to create our own rule of life, and we were inviting people into practices of prayer and solitude and retreat and worship and generosity and things like that. Eventually, fast forward a couple years, as we got a little bit bigger as a church and had some programs, and we started to have to imagine, like, well, what are our programs going to be? We ended up creating, we borrowed this tool from Zig Ziglar, this like leadership coach of all places, but he has this thing called the Wheel of Life, where he just sort of takes a life as an assessment tool and goes, hey, here are the 6 or 7 parts of your life. You have like your vocational life, you have your relational life, you have your financial life, you have your physical life, you have your spiritual life, right? And so in his point, when he would use it with leaders, would be to say, you might be killing it in your vocation, but if your marriage is a mess, it will impact your vocation. And you might be doing great relationally or spiritually, but if your finances are a mess, your whole life will feel it, right? And so we said, well, why don't we just use this simple framework and develop kind of a holistic school of life, right? Through kind of this Jesus framework, and go, we are going to help you grow in every area of your life as we sort of submit to God's leadership there and build practices and cohorts and all the rest. And so our church, we began to say every year, will you take a season to pray and discern what area of your life God might be inviting you to grow in this year, and to commit to join a group of people who are also feeling led to grow in their vocation or their finances or their relationships or their physical health. And over the course of that year, as we kind of invested in a curated set of spiritual disciplines and physical disciplines, that we would begin to see the transformation we were after. I mean, and then we would measure this stuff. We used to say that we were going to be ruthlessly entrepreneurial about this endeavor, to the degree that if we wanted to say, hey, we want to see that we'd be more generous, and even sort of scandalous stuff, but like if we get in a Bible study and we read about generosity all year long, but none of us have given anymore, then we'll throw out Bible study and try something else. Like we were that committed to change that we were willing to question the process. We were on the search for the right tools, practices that would deliver the results that we felt we were promising to our community and to those who would risk showing up on a Sunday that we believed God offered. And if we couldn't fulfill that, that was on us, right? And so this was our first 4 or 5 years, was regularly holding out in front of ourselves and our community that we are a church that's committed to pursuing a life worth imitating. And our little elevator pitch would be, regardless of who you are and how cool you think you are and original you are, all of us are following someone, and you owe it to yourself to answer the question, who am I following, and are they worth imitating? And when we believe Jesus is worth imitating, and we invite you to come become his apprentice, let him teach you in the way of life, right? And so much of that, clearly, if you've read any Dallas Willard, I'm just stealing like crazy amounts. This was kind of the center of our vision of the church and what we felt like needed to happen next, what we longed for in our life, and what our community might most respond to. So this clearly shaped us
Yeah.
in a really strong way.
Yeah. Well, and I think like what you're describing would have been, even just like maybe 5 or 7 years ago, Mike would have been longing for that same sort of thing. That it was like, I was struck as I was reading this chapter, because the way that I used to describe discipleship was, and I think I actually got it from another friend, but who had been also shaped by Willard, but I'd say a disciple is somebody who hears and obeys. This is what we do. And so we're just trying to orient our church in a way to help people hear and obey. And I think like there was something that was missing that we were longing for correction in that helped to correct, that it
Mm-hmm.
sounds like was true for you
Mm-hmm.
all as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but at some point
Yeah.
it feels like that was a step in the journey, but it wasn't the final step. Does
Yeah.
that feel
Yeah.
right? Like
It did
yeah.
for sure. Yeah. And just to like double down with you, I mean, just connect a few more dots and maybe people also would have been hearing and experiencing that time. This would have been when I think many of us were first encountering Bob Goff, and just so enamored with the whimsy that he brought. And one of my favorite Bob Goff isms is he used to say that he was done with Bible study because he was into Bible doings.
Okay.
And so it was this idea of like we've had enough time to sit around in circles and learn all the ideas and do nothing with them. And so he would challenge us to say, I want you to sit down, open the text with your community, and then immediately go do whatever you saw, right? And so we were like, this was kind of the thing to what is God saying to you and what are you going to do about it? Those were our two discipleship
Yes,
questions.
yes.
Um, or as Willard says in this chapter, he kind of says discipleship is living your life if Jesus was to live it, right? Who would Jesus be if Jesus was you, right? So kind of taking into consideration kind of your own unique personality, skills, gifts, but living it out in Jesus' way. And so this, man, this really motivated us. And I'll be honest, I think it motivated our community. We saw a lot of eagerness here. We saw a response here. Our little church of about 30 people that started in my living room was over 900 within 4 years. And it was, and we were clear about what we were trying to do. What I'll tell you is that where this started to break down for us a little bit is that when COVID happened, the world kind of slowed down and shut down. After a month or so, and our team realized this wasn't going to be just a couple weeks, but it was going to be an extended season. Uh, we got away for a retreat, and I sort of said to my team, like, "How are we doing? How are you doing?" That was a heck of a 4-year run, and are you still excited by our mission? Is this still moving to you? Is this still why you're here? And, one of the ways I often say it with my team is I'll just say, I understand that you get paid to work here, but you volunteer to get paid here instead of volunteer to get paid somewhere else. Right. And so why is this still motivating to you? Is this still
Yeah.
why you're choosing to show up here and be here and invest in here? And do we want to commit to doing this for the next 5 to 10 years? And this is a safe space, right? And a number of my teammates were like, "Hey, man, if this is what God wants for us, is what we're going to do, I'm on board." But, and as we listened to the buts around the room, we realized we were all experiencing sort of the same thing, which was like we were exhausted, like we were burnt out, and we just realized that the more we spent time with it, we realized like I don't know where this thing sort of got off track, but we feel like we've sort of become a full time um, like life coach organization or like a self help project. And this kind of engineering human excellence and flourishing and fulfillment is really taxing and heavy work. And all of the promise of this seems to be waning. And it's just starting to feel really heavy. And also, it's kind of disappointing because people aren't always seeing kind of the breakthroughs and the change that I think they were longing for, right? And for the first time in my life, I found myself listening to more reformed preachers. Um, like it was during this season that I think Nadia Boltz-Weber became so moving to me because I would listen to her preach, and instead of saying like "you're a screw up," but I'm gonna give you kind of a Jesus solution that's gonna pull your life back together. The good news wouldn't be that like this whole thing would get cleaned up or that you would experience profound transformation, but that God was with you in it and loved you even though you weren't growing in the ways that you hoped you were. And some of that just started to feel really moving to me personally. And so then as things started, we started to have more conversations about this. Some of these critiques had always been there, but I ignored them. There were always people in our room saying, I hear this worth imitating stuff, but it sounds really kind of like cocky or I don't know. And I'm like, no, 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 I hear that. I get that. We're kind of based off Paul. It's not exactly that. And but it also feels very like self-helpy. Why is this not self-help? And then I give them kind of the long-winded, well, no, we can't change, but for God's work in our life. The disciplines are just ways that we make ourselves available to God's grace to work in our life so we might become, But even as I was saying these answers and explaining kind of means of grace and spiritual disciplines and the things we say when we attune to God's presence, God will do God's work in our life to bring about the change. Like I stopped believing some of even what I was saying, or I could hear how long-winded it was getting, and their critique started to feel a little bit louder. And I began to feel like this thing that I was offering, it had, I think, as the kids say these days on TikTok, it had some real like main character energy, right? That I think without, I don't know how it had happened, but I realized that we had centered ourselves, that the entire church experience and expression and mission had put us at the center rather than God, and our own transformation at the center rather than God's character or God's goodness or any form of good life. We had sort of tapped into this drug of kind of like, what are you going to do with your one wild and precious life, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that's fascinating about that I did not find out till later when I was so burdened after I'd seen so many influencers in our church posting that, and I started to be just like, hey, this crushing it, killing it is really killing us kind of stuff. Is I looked up that Mary Oliver poem and come to find out that question at the end that she asks of what are you going to do with your one wild and precious life is after she spends essentially 2 paragraphs talking about just laying in a field all day and watching a grasshopper eat,
Huh.
and how we've kind of like ripped that out of its context and made it the exact opposite of what she intended. And I started to wonder if we'd done maybe the similar thing with our faith. In fact, so many of the people who were following the same pattern of spiritual formation and practices and habits and life transformation, and were trying to be a corrective, I think, to the churches we were raised in that just said, if you think the right thoughts and pray the right prayers, it's all good. I realized that the most common quoted verse, and it's still happening today, I giggle every time I see it, but among our colleagues and the people who've been in this space and have read all these books, for whatever reason, the verses seem to show up at every retreat, conference, and speaker was this one out of Matthew where Jesus says, are you weary and worn out, tired of religion? Come to me and find your rest, right? And I started to wonder if these things were related, that our doubling and tripling down on our transformation, our becoming, our self-actualization via the church was wearing us out, and that this didn't feel like good news anymore. It started to feel like another curse or just a new kind of form of Phariseeism. And so that was the beginning of the unraveling a little bit of some of that for us. But I'll just stop
Yeah.
there.
Well, and did you stop caring about transformation at this point? Like, I'm kind of curious what happens with the project of the movement towards Christ-likeness? Does that become a secondary concern? Does that become if we think about a goal versus byproduct, does that become a byproduct rather than a goal? Like, how did you start thinking about how that sort of fits on the, because you were solving a problem
Yeah.
of people are not becoming the kinds of people that we have said we want to become, and that God,
Mhm.
that we believe that God has like called us to become in some sort of way. We
Mm.
create this church to utilize these sorts of like means to move us in that direction, and now
Mm.
we're exhausted by those means. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
do we throw that out? Like, what ended up being your solution around that?
So it's clearer in hindsight. It was messier in the process. We In the process we kind of began to take inventory of where we had noticed God at work in our church. And we just had to start. I think we've got a pretty strong like authenticity gene in our culture at our community, and so part of us just said, even if this is the right thing, even if this is a beautiful, and it may be a beautiful mission for a church, it may not be the mission for our
Mm.
church. that because at the end of the day, when we would think through the testimonies we've heard, the wins we'd experienced, we had enough track record behind it to look back and go, we've had 4 or 5 years of serving and caring for people and building this thing. Um, do our testimonies sound like we are fulfilling this mission? Was it a never ending kind of Yelp reviews that sounded like, I came to this place, my finances were a mess, and by God's grace there, I'm now financially free. My marriage was falling apart, and now I'm in healthy relationships. I was overweight and was kind of abusing food in all kinds of ways, and I've gotten control over, and those weren't any of our
Mm,
testimonies.
mm,
And so we just sort of felt like, man, we've been trying this thing real hard, but it's actually not apparently why people are coming. It's not the wins that our church would point to. And the things that for us specifically, that we began to find were that it was that we had become a place that in some way had reminded people of the beauty of God. And so it felt like a pretty hard pivot. I now think these two things are connected, but at the time we just sort of said, this is a moment when I don't know if the news and the headlines have ever been worse for the church, but we're in the middle at this point of a number of large major pastoral failures around the church, Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, Trump presidency, the rest. The church just was not doing well. And so we felt like what we were hearing and sensing, and the thing we felt uniquely called to do was that despite all the headlines, we wanted to be a gentle reminder to our community that God is more beautiful than what you're being told, than the headlines would lead you to believe. And so is the person next to you. And so what if our mission was something much lighter? What if it was reminding people of the beauty of God? And instead of us saying, hey, we want to transform every area of your life to epitomize kind of your human flourishing, make you superhumans by the power of Christ at work in your life. And we got a program we can put you on. Instead of that being our program, we rooted our reminding people of God's beauty in Psalm 27, where David says, there's one thing that I long to do, is to sit in your temple and gaze after your beauty, right? And in that sentence, in that verse, there's 3 verbs. One is gaze, one is seek, and one is dwell. And we said those sound like an oasis to us. Like, what if those were our programs, that our church created opportunities for people to gaze on the beauty of God, to seek out the mysteries of God, and to dwell in the presence of God on retreats. And so it was just this thing of going like, we've been trying to do the quote unquote right thing, but maybe we should just do what God has given us to do, which is our thing of reminding people of the beauty of God. But what I think I connected to around there is all of these spiritual disciplines all started with an idea of just spending time with God.
mm,
And if we hadn't gotten so distracted by all the navel gazing and measuring and transformation, and is our church more generous than it was, and more forgiving than it was, and more merciful than it was, and all, if we had just been willing to trust that being in the presence of God would be the thing that we most needed, both as a team and that our church needed, we could leave some of those results to God and see kind of what comes from that. And the other thing I'll say that helped, sort of a sidetrack, is I bumped into, and I've come to find a couple voices have been really helpful here, but the first critique I bumped into was a book by Sky Jahani. I think that's how you say his last name, but it's called With.
Yep.
And in it, he lays out these 4 postures. It's a bit of a critique where he says the way that we relate to God is that many people either relate under God, which is to say, God's got these laws, and if you obey them, good things will happen for you. So we live under God. Others of us try to live above God, which is to say, God sort of built the universe with a certain grain to it. And if you can figure out the principles at play and leverage them for your life, you can kind of get what you want out of this life. Another would be that you live from God. This is sort of prosperity stuff that we just ask God to deliver us or whatever. Others is for God, that we kind of we use God to get purpose and meaning in our life. We sort of hijack God's agenda to give us a platform, a stage, a significance. And he kind of challenges all of those ways of relating to God and says, the gospel is not that you would live under, over, from, or for God, but that you would live with God. That the gospel at its center is a life with God, and that all of these other ways of being He doesn't say it this way, but I would say it this way now, that these are kind of utilitarian Christologies.
Mm.
These are where we use God to get what we want. And I think what I realized in that moment, and I have since, is that if I go back to my roots and kind of my early faith that I was given, handed down of, um, hey, say this prayer, and when you die, you'll go to heaven, and you also get to see your grandma, right? That that I was using God to achieve eternal security. What I wanted most was eternal security. In fact, I remember being in a class at divinity school one time. I think it was with actually Stanley Hauerwas, and somebody was asking him one of these questions about, like, what do you think about heaven? You think when we get there, you think we'll recognize each other? You think I'll see my grandma? You think I'll be my dog? You think we'll know one another? And he kind of interrupted and said, God will be there too, right? And it was it was it was just like, oh, right. And such a critique of, when you think about it, like, how utilitarian that transaction was. That you would place your faith in Jesus so that you might get this eternal thing, with no eye towards actually wanting to be with God. Sam Wells says this thing, like, even if you think about this, and um, surely heaven is not just existence for eternity, and definitely not solitary existence. I mean, that starts to sound a lot more like hell. Heaven isn't just that you keep on being. Heaven is that you are with God and with each other and
Mm.
with the
Mm.
new creation, right? This is our good news. And yet somehow in that first version of faith I was handed, it was, use Jesus to get this eternal thing, or to see your grandma, and then, as Willard will point out, the left version of that would be, let's use this Christology, let's use this Jesus story to see or achieve the justice we want in the world right now. Let's do that thing, right? And here's where I think that the Willard stuff for me is kind of situated, is I think it was a great corrective in some ways to both of those, but I'd almost put it alongside of it, is it was another version of saying, as Dallas says throughout the book, I'm not denying that eternal destiny is insignificant. It's so meaningful. It's just not the whole thing. Nor is justice insignificant. It's profoundly meaningful and part of the kingdom of God. It's just not the whole thing. I would say this kind of work of spiritual formation also so meaningful, kind of our individual transformation and salvation from ourselves and our broken ways of being. But it too is not sort of the ultimate or the end, right? And that the gospel, as best I've come to understand it, kind of transcends but includes all of those things. That the gospel, that the good news, which should sound like news and also be good, is that in Jesus, God has determined never to be without us, right? And that to me began to change the way I understood spiritual formation, spiritual discipline. I'm Methodist. John Wesley's final words on his deathbed were, and best of all, God is with us, right? And in this life, in the life to come. And so from here, we begin to kind of pull apart that the problem that we're really facing, or that we really want to center, I think, in the scriptures and in the story, is not so much our limitation as much as it is our isolation. It's not that we have been that we're not the full version of ourselves, but that we have become isolated, not only from ourselves, but from God and from each other. And that what we see in Jesus is that God is determined never to be without us and to leave us isolated from one another. And this is sort of good news that I experience every time I tap into one of these spiritual disciplines and make space to be present to God. And it's a foretaste of what will come for eternity, right? We get to practice now being with the God we will be with forever. Whereas some of the spiritual formation stuff, I think sometimes is so oriented to fixing and mending and whatever's broken in us, that we might achieve something, which, thanks be to God, will not be the program in eternity. And So anyway, this has sort of been the journey for me around all this. I feel so indebted to Willard on it. But I think there is kind of a basic operating system underneath it all that's not too dissimilar from some of the things he was critiquing.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, we've been chatting here now for 40 minutes, and you and I chatted for like 15 minutes before this, and it's been messing me up now for the last hour, a bit in a really good way. And I'm kind of curious, like in some of just because he gets a little bit practical in this chapter, I'm curious about
Mm,
some of the pragmatics of how you see this working itself out, because you had the pragmatics worked out for your church around, um,
mm,
around a system that like was about personal transformation. And there was
mhm,
a way to do that and a way to measure that and all of that, that I knew I could know if I'm making progress on that. And I have
mhm,
specific ways to do that. And, and Willard, in a lot of ways, for me, one of the things that was helpful was that the way that he talks about spiritual disciplines for me was like such a freeing move, where he says it's like anything that you can do by direct effort that opens you up for God's Spirit to do in your life, what you can't do by direct effort, which like
mhm,
opened me up to like, oh, I don't have to feel guilt around I'm not doing X, Y, and Z, but I can be imaginative about what these disciplines are.
mhm,
And so I wonder what that then
mhm,
looks like, where the focus shifts to, if I'm hearing you right, disciplines and transformation are about moving ourselves towards being with God, and an orientation that's with God, gazing upon God, upon the beauty of God, experiencing a life that recognizes God's presence with us, as opposed to disciplines being about changing aspects on the wheel of life about ourselves.
mhm, mhm.
D-
Yeah,
So yeah, how does that tangibly start to like work itself out? What do those disciplines look like, or are there
yeah,
disciplines, or like, yeah, how do you move in
yeah,
that direction?
yeah. And man, that just jarred a few things loose. So I don't want to lose this thought, but help me get back, Mike, if I miss it. But I think part of where uh, I think being a parent has helped shape some of this for me, right? I heard kind of a student of Willard recently, a very influential person, somebody who shaped my own preaching voice. Definitely top 5 most influential preachers in my life, but who's a deep student of Willard and whose mantra is become that the most important thing to God is what you become. That the most important thing to God is what you become. And there was something about that to me that I think, once again, getting back to kind of some of my critique on some of this, or where I've been a little left dissatisfied with it, is like, I think width is a beautiful challenge to that. That feels heavy. That feels like a burden. That feels like a yoke that I'll just never fully satisfy. And it's not true to how I think about my
Huh.
children. The most important thing to me about my son Levi or my daughter Stella is not who they become. It's just being with
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
They are the most important thing to me, right? And I think that's where this goes when you get too focused on kind of the measuring and gauging and trying to, I think, in a really virtuous way, close the gap between what we say we believe and what our actual lives look like in the world. And we take spiritual transformation and formation seriously. Is that if we're not careful, eventually it leads us to a point where we feel like the good news is just the most important thing to God is what we become, which is a burden too heavy to carry. And and I think another symptom of that, to the question you were asking, is about um, is what do your spiritual disciplines look like? Well, one of the things I noticed about both many of the people who've been shaped by Willard most, and the kind of rule of life experience that I see so many people pick
Yep.
up, and the way that we picked it up as a church, is how solipsistic that whole exercise is. That we once again build it around Project Self and go,
Mm.
I can't tell you how many seminars I've been in that have told me, there's 15 different ways to pray. Pick the best way for you. There's lots of change you want to see in your life. Pick the discipline that will grow you the way you want to grow, right? Like, we each get to create our own unique sort of pathways to God. And in some ways, I think that's true. but it's like this, it's related to, I think, our obsession with personality profiles, that you can't be on a podcast without saying your Enneagram number. I'm a 1, by the way. But is like, how much of us can we consume before? I think so much of what I've been challenged with in my ministry over the last 5 years is being reminded, like, it's about God, stupid. Like, it's, how do you lift your eyes? I've had to train myself even in sermons to go, what am I saying about God today? Right. Or I have to, in the subtitle, one of the hacks I put is I just have to start every sermon podcast subtitle with the good news about, right? Is this good? Is it news? If it's neither of those, it isn't a sermon. And so much of this has been like centered on ourselves. So I think all these practices and finding the ones that work best for you and the rest, to some degree, is helpful when it's in the right lane of where do you experience God
Okay.
at work in your life, for presence. But here's what I'll say about it: is so many people that I've found that have lifted this up, and I'm one of them, is that, and I bet most of the people on your podcast are folks from a non-denom, free church, low liturgy sort of space, right? And so I think it's merited. I think part of the dissatisfaction folks got is that going in a room and listening to somebody talk for 45 minutes about ideas, if that's the whole of your faith and singing a couple songs, then you are being malnourished. And there is spiritual formation that's missing. And there's a reason why you're searching for disciplines to prop up your life. And you haven't been tethered to a tradition that has curated that in any sort of way for you in the wisdom of time in the church.
Hmm.
And so we all just piecemeal the whole thing together. My buddy Jacob Breeze, who's a pastor Episcopal church in Houston, one of my favorite connections he's made for me is their church's mission is to live a Jesus-centered life, which help people live Jesus-centered lives, which to me, I'm like, you can be the biggest discipleship junkie on the planet, and I think that will pass your test, right? So Jesus-centered lives. And he goes, so here's how we're going to help you do that. There are 5 practices we think everyone should participate in to lead a Jesus-centered life. The first one is that you need to gather with other people. And that means your friends, that means family, it means strangers, it means enemies. It means you don't retreat into isolation. That what we see in Jesus' life is that he gathered with other people. So if you want to live a Jesus-centered life, you're going to have to spend time with other people. You're going to need to listen for God's voice in your life by reading the scriptures and engaging in prayer. You're going to need to respond to what God says to you in those spaces and do what God's asking you to do if you want to lead a Jesus-centered life. You're going to need to treat every table in your life as a feast of mercy, an extension of our communion table. And then finally, you're going to have to imagine that every place you find yourself, that you've been specifically sent there by God to love those people. That if you gather with other people, if you listen for God's voice, if you respond to what God's saying, if you turn every table into a feast of mercy and see every place you show up as a place that God has sent you, then you will be on the path to leading a Jesus-centered life. And then he says, and oh, by the way, those are the 5 moves of our worship service every Sunday, right? And so to me, this is one of those things where the tradition has become such a gift. I didn't grow up around it, but seeing the ways that God is forming us inside of our gathered time on Sunday, that I haven't had to go create some elaborate, extra heavy, sort of experience. Like, part of where I got, just tired listening to some of this stuff is Dallas talking about, the spiritual disciplines. And he starts getting practical later in this chapter. And he's like, you need to read the scripture and do it seriously. And he tells a story of reading the Gospel of John all day long and not stopping, right? Or fasting and being on a retreat for ages and ages. And I'm like, this is the stuff that sounds really heavy. But what I've found is that in our gathered worship life together, there are so many practices and spiritually forming tools, from the prayer of confession to pardon and forgiveness, to exchanging signs of peace, to benedictions, to feasting at the table and baptism, that are shaping us more and more into God's image. And it's not to say that the disciplines are not needed. They are. But I think they get to be gifts for us of ways to be in the presence of God, and trust that, like everybody says, like, you ultimately become whatever the 5 closest people you hang out with. Who you hang out with is who you become like. So it's not as complicated as it sometimes seems. The spending time with God will make you more like God. Um, but the good news is that God wants to be with you, not that you need to become something else.
Ah, gosh, there's so much there. One of the last things that you said reminded me of, did you ever read Barbara Holmes' book? Something Joy. It's about, she
Yeah.
talks about contemplative practices in the Black church tradition. And
Mm.
one of the moves that she makes is that contemplative practices in the white church tradition, we often mean solo, personal, sort of like get away by yourself,
Mm.
read the Gospel of John all
Mhm.
day, go on this retreat. All day, and
Mhm.
she makes the argument in the Black church tradition that contemplative practices are often corporate practices. And that,
Mhm.
like, she would make the argument that like a call and response in the Black church is a contemplative practice.
Yeah.
Um, and so some of what I'm hearing you say is that there's there's these practices that are a part of the communal experience of church, that the way that you are doing your worship service, especially in a tradition that has been forming that liturgy over years, that that liturgy is actually doing the formation work as you show up and you are a part of the gathered experience on a Sunday morning.
Yeah. No, I believe it. I mean, those are the things that we've found as I've made a shift in my own life from like the formation, the trellis,
Yeah.
the vine
Yep.
grows on, right? For me has been found in what's been handed down, and that I don't have to like reinvent the wheel, start from scratch, build my own bespoke spiritual life. But that I've been given this gift. I mean, so many examples of this, but early on in our church, we were really fortunate and blessed to have a number of um, LGBTQ folks begin to worship with us, but I'd never addressed it. It was that issue. It wasn't on our website. Our denomination at the time was not um, affirming. We were intending and hoping to be that kind of church, but our denomination wasn't. And so at a certain point, I asked folks, "I'm so thrilled you're here." Um, and that there's a number of folks uh, who identify as LGBTQ in our community. But I feel like I got enough of a relationship. I can ask you this, but will you tell me why? Like, why do you like it here? Why are you coming here? Why has this felt like home to you? And they every single time folks just say, "Oh, well, because on the first Sunday I came, you stood behind the communion table and you said, 'Christ our Lord invites to his table all who love him, repent of their sins, seek to live with peace with one another.'" And I thought you were talking to me. And I was like, "Oh, yeah, 100%." Right. I've had the same experience with divorced folks or people in recovery. I had people who would say that the community at this place is so rich. And I was a little baffled because our small group program was not that strong. And so I would ask them, "Well, why do you think community is so strong?" Well, every week when we baptize one of these children, the whole congregation turns, surrounds them, and makes a pledge to live their lives in such a way that this child might come to know the goodness of God, right? And we go, "Got it." And eventually I started to catch on that this liturgy I was handed was much more than a script, but that it was a means of grace that God was using to form community, to bring us together, to bring us into wholeness, to the point where eventually people would say, "Do you have a marriage ministry?" And I would say, "Yeah, it's called the Passing of the Peace." Because every Sunday, whether you just got in a fight with your spouse on the way here or not, there's going to come a moment in the service where I'm going to invite you to turn and exchange signs of peace with those near you. And we say a handshake, a hug, or even a kiss for those you love. So we're going to force you to kind of make up when you get here, right? And we found those kind of moments all throughout this beautiful discipline of worship that's been given to us that puts at the dead center communion, union with God, kind of the good news that we have to offer, which is that God longs to be with you and meet with you today, regardless of what you become or don't, and that God will be with you forever, regardless of what you face and overcome or don't, right? And that began to feel like good news to our team that was pretty tired and worn out on honestly the religion we had created for ourselves of self-actualization via spiritual disciplines.
Yeah. And you said earlier, one of the things that like caught my attention, you said earlier was you said, what if our mission was lighter?
Hmm.
Which gosh, yeah, I don't know what all to say about it, but there is something that there's something really appealing to me, obviously, about the spiritual formation movement. But then there's also like
Hmm.
when I interact with churches that have based themselves around that like that's probably a good language to use around it. It feels heavy
Hmm.
and like they
Hmm.
take themselves overly seriously in a way that's not compelling
Hmm.
to me, but like what their project is compelling to me. Um,
Yeah.
so, so this,
If
yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, if I haven't lost you and your audience by now, here's the last. This will
Okay.
definitely sync the conversation. But I'm a United Methodist pastor. Our mission as our denomination is the same mission that I think the majority of churches have, which is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. One of the things I've noticed though about that language of disciples and discipleship that's become interesting to me is that one, I'm not a Greek scholar, but disciple is essentially translation for pupil or student. Um, and so much of what we came from was based in teaching. And so the next kind of step out is to say, well, what if I just had better students? I've been up here teaching for so darn long, but you guys have been pretty crummy students. We need to make better students. How do we make better teachers? And so many of the metaphors and things that we've been given are all around disciples and discipleship. But one of the things that is interesting to me about that is that outside of the Gospels and the book of Acts, kind of the second book of Luke, outside of those who walked with Jesus, the New Testament never uses the word disciple again. And Paul addresses the church in all of his letters. He doesn't call them disciples or students, he calls them
Yeah.
saints. He appeals to their identity, not to their process, and not to their education, not to their status as a student of a rabbi who they were literally walking with, but those on the other side of ascension who come to faith uh, for whatever reason that Paul and the church and the rest of the New Testament drops the language of discipleship. And so I'm not trying to start kind of a theological controversy there, but it has tempered my fervor around that particular metaphor, that language, and to say, like so many other things in our faith, we need to hold them in tension with whether it's atonement theories or the rest. Like, how can we hold multiple witnesses at the same time? Clearly, discipleship was a strong idea and brand in the Gospels, but we neglect, especially in kind of the evangelical church, the language of saints, and I think that has been interesting to me, and also good news to remind people of the identity that's been given to them in God outside of their own doing.
Dude, um, okay, I mean, I have used up a lot of your time today, and so I don't want to go on forever, but is there anything that we're
No,
like missing that you wanted to talk about in this? Because you've given us so much like richness here, and like I feel like we've hit on all the stuff of the chapter without talking directly about the
yeah,
chapter, but it's definitely come out of it. Yeah.
yeah,
Is there anything we're missing?
I don't think so. I missed my clickbaity moment, but I think that was probably spirit at work. Um, that's just for you and me. I'll send you a screenshot of that in a Osteen,
Oh
we can start a
no.
game.
Now people,
Was it Willard or was it Osteen?
oh, folks have no context for that.
I
I'm
know.
sorry.
There's no way. It's
I'm
fine.
sorry, friends.
You're
Um,
good.
well, for people that want to like track what you're doing, what Church on Morgan is doing, like that they're compelled by the way that you're talking about the church and transformation of faith and all of that. How can they be paying attention to that, engage in that work? What does that look like?
Um, well, I'm kind of a unplatform sort of
Yeah.
guy. I'm off Instagram. I'm not writing any books or pushing any products.
Which, by the way,
But
can
our
I say
church,
kind of pisses me off because I like
it's
just this hour. I'm like, how? Yeah. we can talk about that another time.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say though, I'm so fortunate to be a part of a really beautiful community that I think means a great deal to some folks here in our city and has benefited from so many communities around the country and the world. And if in some way we can be helpful in nudging others into their sort of God-given mission, then by all means, check us out, follow along. We're on Instagram at Church on Morgan. Our website's churchonmorgan.org. We got podcasts and things like that, but mostly just a gift to be with you, Mike, and to be a part of this community. And in all humility, I mean, genuinely, I was not looking to show up and cause a rumble, but this book and Willard's work has been so meaningful to me. And I think in order for it to actually flourish long term, my hunch is it needs to sort of be put in its right place, and that the good news starts and ends with God. And our transformation is just fruit of that, but not sort of the reason for our gathering. And so in the same way that salvation looks like, getting to see grandma, and justice taking root in the earth, and us becoming the fullest versions of who we were made to be, praise be to God. But ultimately, best of all, God is with us. And that has felt like such fresh water in what can sometimes be a really difficult spiritual landscape. So I'm thankful for that corrective that Willard offered. And I hope that it maintains its place in the life of the church moving forward.
Yeah, dude, I'm gonna leave it there. That was such a good word. And what a gift. Genuinely, what a gift. I'm gonna be thinking about this conversation for a long time. Thanks, man.
Man, thanks, Mike. Appreciate you, buddy.